Thanks very much for coming. The session tonight is going to look at look at the relationship between through the kind of theorizing of bell hooks. It's going to look at the relationship between political alienation and liberation. It's kind of going to have a number of terms thrown in it. It's alienation, it's theorizing, it's therapy. It's going to have a range of terms. But before getting into bell Hooks's work herself, what I'd like to do is just kind of remind us of the framework that we're working in for all the sessions. And I'd like to say one other thing about the framework, but let me just begin by restating the framework. So the framework, as we've developed last time and in the sessions last year, follows this pattern of kind of convention, disruption, and transformation. It's based, I guess, loosely, but also quite specifically on the philosophy of Heidegger. In Heideggerian terms, what I'm calling conventions, he would call average everyday awareness. And I think our conventions are kind of an average everyday awareness of the way in which things get done. So when we're kind of living in terms of our conventions are kind of in the background of our mind, if we have a mind. Our conventions are in the background. What's in the foreground is our practical everyday coping. So whether it's kind of teaching, therapy, lecturing, banking, those are in the foreground. In the background is our average everyday awareness or our conventions. The idea of that is that our conventions shape us. They shape our way of going about doing things without us being explicitly aware of those conventions. So, let's say some of us grow up eating with knives and forks. It's so taken for granted that knives and forks are the way to eat, that it just seems kind of natural and it's just the way things are. We don't see that it's a product of a particular set of conventions for doing things. It requires a kind of disruption for the conventions to become explicit. So, for example, if we are eating in another cultural context, let's say an Indian cultural context where they eat with their fingers, that's a kind of disruption that allows us both to see our own cultural conventions and to stand in relationship to new kinds of conventions. And so, just again, on the broadest level, disruption of conventions kind of estranges us from our conventions in ways such that we are then able to reflect on, think about, open up new possibilities around conventions, or become more close-minded, so my way is the right way kind of thing. And so that kind of leads to kind of dogmatism, whereas kind of, let's say, an existential response is one that would lead to kind of curiosity and playfulness, and working with the disruption of conventions in order to open new possibilities. That is transformation. In our last session, we looked at romanticism in terms of this framework. And one of the things that we were saying there is that romanticism arises in the disruption of a particular set of conventions, um, and it arises particularly um, in at the limits, let's say, of a rationalist mode of thinking. Um, Rationalist frameworks of thinking, and I'm speaking very generally at the moment, but rationalist process of thinking is about objectivity. It's about analyzing statements. It's about thinking kind of divorced from the body, so thinking with the head. It's all about order and objective truth. Um, and Romanticism uh, arises in that kind of moment of the limits of rationalism. And those limits of rationalism are the kind of experiences of kind of meaninglessness uh, and emptiness of the rationalist tradition. Um, and The rationalist tradition kind of promotes a sense of emptiness and meaninglessness because it says things like only that which is objective is real. And anything that's kind of like a story or a poem or anything like that is kind of, in its broadest sense, is condemned as unreal. Um, and so that in for romanticism, that leads to a sense of disenchantment with the rational world. So romanticism arose in the context of a disenchantment of rationalism. Um, and I think one of the ways we might have played with it last time was in terms of Max Weber's notion of bureaucracies as kind of very rational, uh, efficiency-driven kind of organizations um, that kill the spirit and meaning and purpose that people bring with them to work. I'll just speak personally around that for a moment. I taught in a university for about 25 years. At the beginning, it was really great, and as lecturers, we were really allowed to create our own courses, teach them in a way that we wanted to teach them, and it allowed for a lot of bringing ourselves into the lecture room, into the curriculum, into the course construction, and so on. By the time I was leaving the university, everything had kind of become so standardized. Um, so I used to teach a course called The Philosophy of Management. Um, and I wasn't the only person who taught that. There were two other people who taught it. But every lecture had to be the same content, the same outcomes, the same process, and more my sense and my colleagues' sense of self as participating in the process of knowledge creating was evaporating more and more. Um, and so there was kind of a massive sense of disillusionment, disenchantment with the managerialist ethos that had been taking over the universities. Everything was pushed from the top down, and our role was just to conform to what was being pushed down, ironically in the name of critical thinking. But that's a bit of an irony there. And I think that's the kind of disenchantment that romanticism is getting to, the disenchantment that rational, efficiency-driven practices have. They all look great on paper. It all looks very neat and tidy, and everything looks like it's so easily manageable. But it takes the human out of the whole process. And so romanticism was arose in response to that dehumanization, disenchantment. And so that was the disruption of rationalist conventions. Um, and so what Romanticism was aspiring to or promoting was a kind of sense of uh, creating ourselves, um, that we're not just heads, detached heads, that we embodied beings, um, and that it's not, the world is not only an object to be exploited, but it's a place in which we live. It's a home. The world is a home. It's not just an object. I guess under conditions of rationality, the world generally is seen as an object to be manipulated, and we are ourselves seen as resources to be manipulated as well. And Romanticism was speaking more to the themes of connectivity, of being present, of being involved, of allowing the imagination to develop. And we used Robin Williams, the Dead Poets Society, as an example of the relation between the disengaged classroom where everybody's just looking around and not involved in anything, and Robin Williams creating the space of kind of engagement and a sense of mystery again in teaching and learning. And so that's what we did in the last session. The convention was rationality. The disruption is the disenchantment, the sense of meaninglessness created by, let's call it methodological rationalism and bureaucratic rationalism, I guess, and romanticism as opening up new possibilities. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that line from Kierkegaard, where he compares the world of possibility to drinking wine. And he kind of, just paraphrasing him a little bit, he says, if you, something to the effect that if you have a little wine, it kind of opens you up and makes you feel a little bit more excited and responsive and open to the world. And Kierkegaard was saying, but no wine is as sparkling as that of possibility. Possibility is kind of what kind of gets us going. Possibility creates enthusiasm. It opens up spaces for us. Uh, we see all kinds of new possibilities in this world of possibility. And I guess one analogy to that is starting off a new venture. Well, for Kierkegaard, it is, starting a venture. Venturing for Kierkegaard is creating possibilities. And so going on an adventure is opening possibilities and not always knowing where you're going in advance, but being willing to go with not knowing where you're going. And I guess that kind of fits also into Romanticism. Rainer Maria Rilke, in his letters to a young poet, often said, learn to love the uncertainty, learn to love the questions, um, not just go for control, for the solutions before you've experienced the question. So I want to bring that framework tonight to bear on bell hooks and the politics of liberation. And I want to say that in this context of the politics of liberation and bell hooks, the conventions that are being dealt with are white colonialism, whether it's kind of American colonialism, British colonialism, South African apartheid colonialism, colonialism in the Middle East as well. Hooks is, I think she's still alive. Hooks is a thinker that works with the oppression and alienation produced by colonialism. And so colonialism is the set of conventions around which her thinking emerges. And as we will discuss, the kind of disruption of colonial conventions for Hooks occurs in moments of alienation. Okay, so one of the concepts that I would like to introduce from Hooks and from some others tonight is the notion of alienation as a disruptor of conventions. And for Hooks, the new world that is opened up is, to use an overused word, is a world of liberation from the shackles of colonialism, and in Hooks also not just liberation, but love. Love is one of the ideas that she opposes to colonialism. That colonialism bred this kind of alienation and the disenfranchisement of people. And Hooks comes up with this notion of love. And one of the important points of this notion of love, and I hope we get to discuss it in more detail, is that love is not creating another set of binaries. So let's say under colonialism, you get the binary of black and white. Love, in the case of Bell Hooks, is embracing both black and white. It's not saying either or. It's saying that we all need to be freed from the kind of dominance of a set of colonial values. And so it's love and it's liberation from her side. I would also like to add another voice to what we're going to discuss in terms of Hooks. I'd like to add the voice of Nelson Mandela, because I think there's kind of a lot of parallel between Hooks and Mandela, of course, in different contexts. Hooks is in the context of kind of teaching, so I haven't really introduced Hooks, and I'll do so in a few minutes. Hooks's work is in the context of teaching, but also in the context of political activism as well. And the liberation she has in mind is a liberation from a dominant set of conventions, and again, colonial conventions. And Mandela also lived in a similar space. Um, Mandela did grow up in a set of colonial conventions, and in his autobiography, on a number of occasions early on in the autobiography, he speaks about his idealization of white people, um, and he's kind of I'm putting it a bit stronger than he did, but kind of not denigration, but inferiority, a sense of inferiority of black people in relation to white people. Um, and it was only kind of when he was well into his 20s that there was a disruption of this kind of idealization of whites and inferiority of black people. Um, and initially he came to espouse an African nationalism, um, um, which was a big move from him because it went beyond his tribal identity. He'd grown up, his tribal identity was one in which he was supposed to become a chief in the tribe. But in his early 20s, he went beyond his tribal identity and embraced an African nationalism. So that was an opening up of one possibility, a new way of seeing things for Mandela. But I mean, he quickly went beyond an African nationalism to a sense of democracy, an inclusive democracy, in which, like Hooks, and maybe even more strongly than Hooks, I'm not sure, but you know, he embraced his enemy in that kind of liberation struggle in the democracy. So again, he didn't collapse into a set of binaries. Uh, he brought opposites together in terms of a greater whole. Um, and so again, it's this conventions and idealization of the conventions of colonialism, the disruptions of those conventions in moments of alienation, the disruption of the conventions, and then opening new possibilities, embracing his enemy, democracy, which also, like in Hooks, we've got to say that for Mandela, as hurt as he was, and he was hurt until the end of his life, he was hurt, but he also embraced the other, the enemy, and so an act of kind of extreme sensitivity to the anxieties of his enemies. And we'll see if we get to speak about that as well. Um, so, what are so the convention is colonialism, the disruption is alienation, and the transformation is, in the case of Hooks, love, a kind of philosophy of love, the classroom as a space of love, um, and love and liberation and connectivity. In a sense, something like the romantic philosophers that we spoke about a little earlier. This kind of love being present. In fact, she speaks quite often about lived experience and that theorizing needs to take place in the context of lived experience. And I think that's a theme that I'd like to stress for tonight, is this theme of the connection between lived experience and theorizing. And so Uh, to do that, I would just like to take a little step backwards and say something about Heidegger, because I think Heidegger paves the way for rethinking the relationship between theory and lived experience. And so let me say something about Heidegger in that context. Um, so I think it's becoming more and more clear that Heidegger was a critique um, of the Cartesian and rationalist tradition in philosophy. And he was a critique of, I'm just going to make it a very general statement. He was a kind of critique of textbook philosophy. He believed he was disappointed when he entered the world of philosophy um, because he came to see that what philosophy was doing, or what the mainstream in philosophy was doing, was studying the texts of philosophers. So if you do a course in philosophy, um, you don't really get to be philosophical. You study the texts of Hegel, Heidegger, Plato, Aristotle, whoever that might be. And I think it's the same in a lot of psychotherapy as well, that you get to study a module which has kind of certain theoretical underpinnings, but you're studying the texts of these things. And Heidegger was very disappointed with this uh, approach to philosophy. And in Being and Time, there's one particular line where he says that in philosophy, the concept of being has been reduced to material for reworking, which in other words means when we study being, we're studying the texts of being. We study what Plato thought about being, or we study what Aristotle thought about being, but we don't come near to being itself. And Heidegger's whole philosophy, in the early years at any rate, is about standing in the presence of being. Um, and one of the notions that was central to this standing in the presence of being is the notion of mood. So mood and emotion are both theorized, and listen to my language, both theorized in Heidegger in Being and Time. And generally the distinction between uh, um, uh, a mood and emotion is that uh, moods are much longer lasting than emotions. Emotions are more fleeting than moods. Moods last for much longer. And also, for Heidegger, uh, emotions tend to have particular objects and objects that kind of trigger the feeling. Whereas, generally speaking, for Heidegger, moods have no objects. In fact, and I don't know if this is going to make sense, moods disclose the world to us. So moods disclose the world to us. So we have feelings, but in the context of moods. So if this is not making much sense, let me try quickly give an example. An example, I don't know how many of you have experienced it. So with a potentially new client. They come in, or even beforehand, you have a conversation with them, um, and the world of therapy makes no sense to them. You can talk about the existentials, or you can talk about ego, superego, id, or repression, or defense mechanisms, and they'll tell you you're talking fluffy, woolly stuff. It's not real until the moment that they experience some living disruption. Um, and when they experience some living disruption and find themselves in therapy, suddenly the world of therapy is disclosed to them, so that they can begin to take notions of reflection, of defense mechanisms, of working through uh, all this language which had no meaning to them, uh, suddenly is open for them. As they can see that they hook onto this language as a way of orienting themselves in the world. And so for Heidegger, this is a mood. Moods open up the world for us. Um, and Heidegger believed that thinking takes place in moods. Okay, and in Being and Time in particular, the mood in which thinking takes place is the mood of anxiety. Okay, it's in anxiety for Heidegger that we come to question our existence. Um, and it's a very interesting thing that Heidegger's doing there. Like, he's saying that we don't just sit down in a classroom and theorize. For Heidegger, that's kind of empty theorizing. It's bad theorizing. Good theorizing happens when we're in the mood of questioning, you know. So anxiety for Heidegger is a mood of being in question. In anxiety, my being's in question. And therefore, for Heidegger, being in anxiety leads to the questioning of being. Okay. I guess what I'd like to stand out uh, most fully is that questioning occurs in the mood for Heidegger of something. There are a number of words that we can use to say there. It's the eros of questioning. It's the passion of questioning. When I used to supervise PhD students, the first thing that I used to deal with them was, what's your passion? What's your eros? What's driving you to ask this question? Because there's nothing else that's going to sustain you through this process, because it's a hard process. You're on your own a lot of the time. You have to give structure. So your questioning must emerge out of some passion. And part of my work with them was to locate the passion out of which their questioning emerges. And so to me, that's very Heideggerian, is locating the passion for which their questioning emerges. And so questioning for Heidegger occurs in the context of anxiety. Tonight, we're dealing with it in a different context. And the theme of what we're saying tonight, based on Heidegger, is that there's a kind of questioning that emerges in the mood of alienation. Okay, there's a kind of questioning that emerges in the mood of alienation. So immediately we've got before us two moods. The one mood we've got is anxiety. Okay, and Heidegger saying questioning emerges in anxiety. And now in terms of this process tonight, what we're saying is that there's another kind of questioning that emerges in another kind of mood, and it's the mood of alienation. And so I want to open up this meaning of this word alienation for us. What is alienation? What do we mean by alienation? Such that it's a mood of questioning. And I'd like to do it not by providing a concept of it to start with, but by providing some lived experience from Hooks and others about this lived experience of alienation, and maybe from there to start developing the concept of alienation. So I'll just say one conceptual point. Alienation is a sense of not being at home in the world. Okay, it's a sense of not being at home in your world. Okay, it's not a sense of not being at home in another's world. It's a sense of not being at home in your own world. And so I want to take Bell Hooks and some of the things she says about herself in her process of developing her pedagogy of liberation. So I'm just taking some quotes from her book. The title's just gone out of my mind. But perhaps let me just start by telling you something about Bell Hooks. So Bell Hooks is recognized as a kind of Black American feminist writer. Her birth name was not Bell Hooks. Her birth name was Gloria Jean Watkins. And that name came down the paternal side of her family. And as she grew older and experienced a sense of marginalization and alienation as a woman and as a Black woman, one of her ways of recrafting her identity was to change her name. And she took a name from the matrilineal side of her family. It was I think it was her grandmother on her mother's side, and she called herself Bell Hooks. And to subvert it one step further, she doesn't spell Bell Hooks with a capital B or capital H. She spells them with a lowercase b and lowercase h. So it's kind of part of her way of subverting the tradition, the colonial tradition, but it's also some way of giving herself an objective identity in the world. It's her way of getting recognition in the world. Okay, this is how she wants to be recognized in the world. So her path in general was a path of moving from a curious young kid with lots of questions about life and the world in which she lives, to kind of being marginalized in the life that she was living, to working through that marginalization of her life, and then to opening up this kind of pedagogy, a theorizing of liberation and love. So I'm just going to read to you some of her statements about her redescript or her reflections on her early alienation in her family of origin. So here, this is a quote. Whenever I tried in childhood to compel folks around me to do things differently, to look at the world differently, using theory as intervention, as a way to challenge the status quo, I was punished. I remember trying to explain at a very young age to Mama why I thought it was highly inappropriate for Daddy, this man who hardly spoke to me, to have the right to discipline me, to punish me physically with whippings, and yet to not be participating in the caring, in the day-to-day caring of me. So she was experiencing at a very young age a sense of dissonance, and not just cognitive dissonance, but emotional dissonance between the way the conventions of her Black world were being lived, and her lived experience of this as being kind of weird and contradictory, and how can this man be disciplining her? But not only how can he be disciplining her, how can he be expecting her to serve on him day to day in the kitchen and so on, you know? But by what right did he have to expect this of her? And these were not intellectual questions. These were really existential questions. They were questions that were coming from her being. She was experiencing a sense of estrangement from her way of life. Okay. I mean, of course, she couldn't conceptualize it in those ways at that time. She was just made to feel weird, and her mother used to say to her when she asked these kind of questions, her mother used to say to her, "Are you out of your mind? Are you mad?" You know, um, so so. So not taking the question seriously, but also rendering her mad for asking these kinds of questions. Not just stupid, but mad. And that distinction between, let's say, stupid and mad, and maybe I'm on shaky grounds here, but it's a useful distinction here, because madness is about completely delegitimating the questions that she was asking. She wasn't simply stupid, you know. She had to even come up with these questions. She must be living on another planet, so to speak, you know. She was so far from the norm, and this so far is two steps of alienation that we've covered so far. First of all, the first sense is her sense of estrangement from the dominant cultural norms of serving her father. You know, why must the mother and the girl children serve the father? Why must they do that? And not as an intellectual question, but as an existential question. So she was estranged. And one of the meanings of alienation is a sense of estrangement from the kind of dominant norms of a culture. But it's important to express and say that in those early stages of estrangement, one doesn't know it as estrangement. And so the second notion of alienation that comes in there is she's mad. You know, the mother keeps saying to her, "You're mad. Are you out of your mind? where did you come from? How the hell did we get to have you as a child? So like totally delegitimating her as well, you know. So she's estranged and she's delegitimated. She's not even on the playing field, okay? She's kind of right out of the park, so to speak. Um, and retrospectively, she starts to describe some of these feelings, and she says, um, she says about her family. Okay, she's speaking about her family. She says, I did not feel truly connected to these strange people. Okay, so in other words, she was finding her family strange, you know. I did not feel truly connected to these strange people. And I think if we can just also say there that her questioning was coming from a sense of estrangement, okay? She felt the estrangement, the weirdness of what was happening. And there was no confirmation from the world around her about what she was saying. So, so she felt that these people that were strange. She says, I did not feel truly connected to these strange people who could not only fail to grasp my worldview, but who just simply did not want to hear it. Okay. So again, we get a sense of her delegitimation, um, but we also get a strong sense of her emotional pain. You know, that there was a strong sense of that she didn't belong where she was. You know, she didn't belong to her own home. And she goes on to say, I was desperately trying to discover the place of my belonging. I was desperately trying to find my way home in her home. Okay. And I think here again, we see a very strong mood um, that she's in. You know, she's in the mood of alienation. She's in the mood of not belonging to this society or this family, you know. So, so here's this disruption of estrangement. Um, and then she goes on to say, so as she's absorbing this disruption, she comes to say, um, and I think this is quite interesting, also because of so many of the ways, well, let me say, in which I've been brought up to think of theorizing. But she says, I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could no longer go on living. Okay, so again, what we see here is theorizing coming out of an existential pain of not belonging, and that it was so intense that that she had to go into this world of theorizing, um, and um, so this was a theorizing in the context of alienation. It was a theorizing that was emerging out of and trying to make sense of the experience of alienation. And so one of the dimensions of theorizing that hooks into, if I can say, um, is the notion of theorizing as sense making. Okay, theorizing as sense making. So what does that mean? You know, theorizing as sense making. So I guess and it also resonates with Heidegger a lot, that you know, in the disruption of our conventions, our sense of things uh, is disrupted, we don't know where we belong. We've got no felt sense. And I guess that's what sense making is all about, is we've got no felt sense of who we are, of where we belong, um, of what our identity is. And so the first part of theorizing for Hooks is a process of sense making. And so sense making is theorizing as kind of resonating, of being able to name the pain that she was suffering, because again, she didn't initially have a name for what she was going through. So the first part of theorizing for her is a process of sense making, of developing a name, of resonating what she was going through. And the two words that we've used so far are sense making, as sense making. Sorry, my mind just got distracted. Sense making, so theory as sense making, theory as developing a felt sense, theory as resonance. And I guess for therapists, this, opens a lot for us as well. One of the questions, it would be, what is the relationship between theorizing and therapy in this kind of context? Because therapy is also very much a process of naming, of making sense of, and so what is the difference between therapy and sense making? And just as shortcutting that for a moment, Hooks's view on that is that her estrangement didn't have anything to do with her, for want of a better word, intrapsychic self. It didn't have anything to do with her inner self. It had everything to do with the context of conventions in which she lived. So it was much more a social than a psychological kind of process. So she was looking at not at individual psyches, but she was looking at political structures and how political structures marginalize and alienate, or political conventions, how they marginalize and alienate us, and how we internalize those kinds of conventions without kind of realizing that we internalize those conventions. And so that leads to kind of the second step of theorizing, which she doesn't call it this, but I'll call it consciousness raising. Okay, so first there's a recognition of the alienation, naming the alienation, naming the estrangement. Then the second part of it is developing a consciousness of that alienation. A consciousness of the conventions of the alienation. I don't know if that sounds like too much of a mouthful. I'll just say it again and then explain it, and then we can take a short break. So the first stage is kind of naming the process, the experience, which is part of the process of theorizing. The second part of the process of theorizing is consciousness raising. consciousness raising refers to the awareness that the sense of the negative sense of self that, let's say, the oppressed have, the sense of alienation that they have, is not based in their own personal sense of inadequacy, but is grounded in a sense of inadequacy of playing on an uneven playing field, so to speak. So in terms of kind of racism, it's kind of black people playing in a white man's world, historically, like, and not being able to see themselves as good enough because they're evaluating themselves in kind of standards that are not their standards, and they don't realize it. And consciousness raising is becoming aware of these kind of, I'll just say, prejudiced conventions in terms of which they have looked at themselves. And so we've introduced two of the moments of theorizing: naming and then consciousness raising, which can also generally be called a kind of reflexive awareness of the conditions which shape your particular existence, becoming aware of the social, political conventions that shape your conditions of existence. And I think that we can then begin to see that the third part of the process of theorizing will be liberation from the kind of chains of those conventions, in disclosing new worlds, in opening new possibilities. I'll stop there. I wonder if before we go to a break, if anyone has any thoughts or so in broad terms, we're using the convention disruption transformation framework to look at the kind of politics of alienation, and I guess the general idea is that alienation is a bad, is a negative. But what Hooks and others are doing is saying, yes, alienation is an estrangement and it is painful, but by working with that pain of alienation, it can be transformed into a set of possibilities. And Hooks sees herself as working within that framework of transforming the pain of alienation into the affirmation of an identity and recognition and a sense of belonging for one. And as we've seen in her own work, she's done it by kind of part of her doing that is renaming herself as Bell Hooks. And another way that she's done that is she's refused to write theory in terms of traditional academic practices of doing theory. So if much of her work reads much closer just to a kind of narrative style of talking, of theorizing, rather than setting up theories as such. Um, and I think that she also moves from theories as a kind of thing or noun to theorizing as an activity and a process. So there kind of is never a fixed theory as such for Hooks. There's this ongoing process of theorizing for her. Um, and as I've said, this process of theorizing contains at least 3 or 4 moments. The first one being the naming of the estrangement, which I think we would readily recognize in terms of therapy as well, is that naming is a big part of a therapeutic process. Naming in Hooks's perspective is focused not on the individuality of the individual, but the way in which the individual is socially constructed, and how that construction lives within the individual, without them knowing that it's being lived within themselves. And that kind of brings up the next moment of theorizing, is the recognition that these senses of perhaps feeling inadequate or inferior or not good enough are not simply located in the psyche of the individual, but actually that in kind of these dominant cultural conventions have kind of marginalized one and created the space in which to already think of themselves as inferior as inadequate. And the beginning of realizing that it's the conditions of existence, if you like, that produces this sense of inferiority, is the beginning of the process of alienation, the beginning of the process of transformation and liberation, and developing a sense of identity. And again, not just as an individual, but as a collective. It's kind of a we rather than just an I, so to speak.